and functions are a very useful and interesting part of programming. And I think you'll find that you're not going to be really learning anything terribly new, just kind of a new way to organize things. So let's get started with functions. The first thing about functions is that a function is just simply a named block of code. See, it says named block of code. In other words, anything that we stick between two of these curly braces, an open curly brace and a closed curly brace, and then we put a name on it, that's going to be a function. So we've already seen the curly braces used to group a bunch of statements together. And so we're going to do the same thing for functions. Now the thing about functions, just like the function for, say, maybe your algebra class or other kinds of things that you've maybe heard the term, that a function can act on a set of values that are given to it, meaning that I can pass it a set of parameters. Parameters are just values that I pass into the function. So like if I'm using the vending machine, I might put in some quarters or a dollar or a credit card. Those would be values that the vending machine would act on. And the parameters would be things like, payments and in terms of quarters and dollars and things like that. Now functions can return a single value. At least in PHP they return a single value. We call that the return value. And that's again like in the vending machine. Once you have put your money in and you've input the item that you want, it'll give you that item. So simply it has an input, which we call parameters, and a output, which we call return values. So functions are going to be really useful when I have a bunch of code that I repeat over and over and over again. So if I need to do the same thing and it uses a bunch of different lines of code, rather than repeat those lines of code, it'll be much more efficient for you just to create a function and then call that function. Especially if that thing that you do varies only based on the parameters that it needs, the particular values that it uses. It's going to find it useful. It's also useful for sharing code, so I might be able to put something into a code function so that I can more easily share it. That code then is kind of hidden, or what they call encapsulated, inside that function, and people often don't have to worry about the details of how the function works. You can just use it. So you might have a function to say, verify a zip code or something like that, and who knows how it works. But if you just call that function verify zip code and you give it a zip code, it'll return yes or no. Is it true, a valid zip code, not valid zip code. You can take that code inside a function and then just use it for different things or share it for different tasks. Also, you'll see that functions help save execution time. It turns out that in PHP, as in other languages, that a function is treated a little bit differently than other code. A function, because it needs to be usable anywhere, it actually takes that function and interprets it first. It pre-interprets it and then sticks it aside so that it can be executed at any time. And believe it or not, this saves time because it's already pre-interpreted. It doesn't have to be interpreted again on the fly. So that's really a neat thing to speed things up. You can use functions. And also modularization. It can divide up the task and help organize things better. You can use it for, say, documenting what you're doing by looking at the functional steps rather than how those steps are actually carried out. And then those names for the functions can be used to describe what you're actually doing rather than how it's doing it. And that's really useful, is you can break things up into the functional steps. Okay, and that's called modularization. So we've already made use of lots of functions. You're already probably familiar with the task. Maybe you can think of a few right now. Can you maybe list in your head a few things that we've already been using? Let's take a look at some. We've already seen things like print, and I'm going to use print with the parentheses here to emphasize that this is a function. So a function will usually be designated with parentheses, and what you put in the parentheses is the parameters, and then this is going to output the character A to the screen. So it doesn't actually have a return value. And you'll see that that's interesting about functions. They don't have to return value. See, and here it is. It says A. And you could also use echo. It's the same thing. Make it echo B. There's B. What other functions have we seen? We've seen things like var dump, right? And I'm going to say var dump echo B because I'm going to want us to see we know that echo and print take on a parameter or parameters, but we don't know if it returns a value. So in other words, if it returns a value, when I do a var dump here, it should tell me what the return value is. It's kind of like printing it out. And here it says unexpected echo because again I'm not returning a value. And let's see if I turn print. And now if I tip print, it says integer 1. So interestingly enough, the echo function doesn't return anything. It just gives me an error, but the print does, and it returns the integer 1. You'll see later on why it does that. So actually now we see the difference between print and echo. Print returns a value, presumably that it's successfully printed, and echo does not. And var dump, of course, is just another function. Incidentally, things like if are not functions. This is a conditional statement. So this doesn't actually get executed. It's not a block of code. It says that execute this next block of code if something is true. And same for while and for and all those things. Those are not functions. Those are just conditional statements. So there is a difference between conditional statements and functions. So can you think of other functions that maybe we've used? Printf, I guess, is some, and maybe some others. PHP literally has thousands of functions that you can use, and you just need to look them up. And so we've used a bunch of array functions, for example, like sort and merge and a whole bunch of other things. So you'll see that PHP is just filled with reusable code that are stored in functions. So some of them are going to be built into PHP, the language itself, things like echo and var dump, and some are added from code libraries, and you'll see that PHP has vast libraries of function codes. And some you're going to create. You're going to create your own. So go ahead and do lab 1, or at least take a look at it now so that you're prepared to do it in class. How do you call a function? So calling a function is how the code that's associated with that function is executed. We call it just like you're calling it on the phone. You call it by just giving it its name. Now, a function is always designated by an identifier. In other words, just like a variable, you have to name a function with a valid identifier. So that means that the function can't start with a number, it can't have any special characters in it, etc., etc. And then you typically use the parentheses, although it turns out in PHP those are optional, but you give it those parentheses to designate that after you call this function, everything inside this parentheses are going to be parameters that are going to be passed in. So this is the name of the vending machine. Say I want the Coke machine, and now here it's going to be put this money in, put this dollar bill in, and give me the Pepsi Max. So for example, here is the identifier called PHP info, and it has no parameters designated by just an empty set of parentheses there. Here's another function called rand. The identifier is rand, R-A-N-D, has two parameters, an integer 1 and an integer 10, and presumably this represents a minimum and a maximum. So you can see that in this case, this function took no parameters, this one took 2. And some functions take arbitrary numbers of parameters. They maybe take, some are fixed in terms of what they take. Some can take a large number of them, like print, for example. You could just keep putting stuff in there. Function names are not case sensitive, which is kind of interesting. They can be upper, lowercase, or even mixed. And the way that we refer to a function is through the interface of a function. The interface sort of defines what it is. And the interface, you'll see in documentation, looks like this. It has the identifier for the function, which is its name, parentheses. Inside that are the parameters, which will be designated by the data type of those parameters that it expects. And then in front of it, they have the return type. So if this function has a return type, you would say what that is. So let's take a look. Let's like if we're calling a function in PHP, maybe we'll define a variable, say commission is sales times rate, and we'll say echo, being print out round $commission, comma 2. So round is the function. It calls the function, passes it the parameters here and here, this one and this one. This is the parameter 1, comma, parameter 2. So parameters are separated in PHP by commas, and the order that they're in is very important. This is the first parameter, which presumably is what it's going to use for the commission, and 2 would be another one for round that says how many decimal places. So in other words, this first one says what am I rounding, what is the value I'm rounding, and 2 is the parameter that it uses to determine how many decimal places to round it to. I'm echoing it because if I'm getting an output from this, meaning that it's not outputting to the screen, it's going to return a value. It's going to return the rounded commission to 2 decimal places, and at which point I need to do something with it, assign it to a variable or maybe echo it. So passing parameters into a function makes them more flexible. So for example, the rand function, this is a sort of a signature for it. It says that it takes 2 parameters. This might be the documentation in the interface, int min, comma, int max. And the way you read this is like, well, this is the identifier, what the function is called and how I call it. And int min means you don't actually use the designator int and you don't ever use min. This just says that the first parameter is expected to be of type integer, and it represents the minimum value. So it's just a sort of documentation saying what kind of data type and what is it used for, comma, int max, same thing. This is going to be an integer, expecting an integer that's going to represent the maximum. The upshot is if I call the function with rand 1, comma 10 here, it's going to give me a random number between, you guessed it, minimum 1, maximum value 10. When you pass a variable into a function through a function call, it can take any expression because an expression returns a value. So that expression will be evaluated first, and then the function will be called with the return value or the output value from that evaluation. So if I say rand 44% 3, that says take 44 modulo 3, divide by 3 and give me the remainder, is what that says, and so that's what's going to be passed in. The remainder after divided by 3, comma 2 times max times min, or max times max, max squared. It's going to take whatever is in max, multiply by max, multiply that by 2, whatever that value is, and it's going to use that for the second parameter. It's quite common to use a variable when you're calling a parameter. It just reads the value out of it because it's an expression that just returns itself. So if I say rand min guess max guess, it's going to just take whatever value is in min guess and use that for the minimum value, and whatever's in max guess and use it for the max value. Here's another function called substr or substring, which has 3 parameters, and it says, hey look, whatever the string is in name, get me the first character with $i characters. So whatever $i is, it'll go get it. So why don't you go take a look at Lab 2 and see if this comes to you, and if you have any questions, don't forget to jot them down. So another useful thing that functions can do other than accept parameter values is they can return values. And PHP basically returns one value and only one. But there are ways to make it return multiple values by returning, say, an array. So some functions perform just an action. In others, like read something from the keyboard or just print something to the screen or whatever it is. And as a result, they don't return a value. So if you notice the echo function doesn't return a value because what it does is it just prints something to the screen. That takes an action by printing something to the screen. So it doesn't actually need to return any value. It just does something. Of course, you saw that the print function does print out a value, return a value, and you probably wonder why it does that. Most functions perform an action and return a single value. And the return types can be any primitive type like integers and floats and booleans, but they also could be a compound type like an array, an object, or something like that. And that's really useful. For example, if I want to return multiple values, I'll just take those values and put them into an array and then have my function return an array. That way I can get more values. If the function returns void, that means that no value is returned. So again, like the echo, it returns void or nothing. Return values are how a function does its work and passes the information back to the caller when that work is done. You can use functions when any value is needed. So any place you can use an expression, you can use a function too. So for example, if I say $guess equals rand110, let's just try that. I'm going to copy that. Okay, then what's going to happen, I'll just do a var dump. I'll var dump this here directly. Var dump $guess just to see what's inside it. You see I get the integer 6. So whatever this was called with the value 1 and 10, minimum 10, maximum 10, give me a random number between 1 and 10, which is going to return that number, which I assigned to guess in a regular any kind of expression, and then I output it. The upshot is if I keep refreshing this, it keeps giving me 6 there, which is not what I want. But see, if I keep calling it, it's giving me a random number between 1 and 10. Again, here are some other examples. I can take a value, the random number, and multiply it by, say, something like pi. No problem. Just whatever the return value here, multiply it by pi. Echo PHP info prints all that out. Or actually, it prints out some value about PHP info. The PHP info outputs to the screen. And you can see I can use it, say yummy equals piece of dot concatenate substring piece, 0, 3. You can see what that does. It's going to take the first 3 characters starting at position 0 of this. So PIE says piece of pie. And I'll just get the PIE string and concatenate that with that. It says piece of pie. And for example, if is int underscore int guess, so if that happens to be an integer, returns true, I can use it in an if statement. So in other words, you use function return values just as you would use any value. It's quite common for a function to return a Boolean expression. If I'm returning a Boolean expression, that is called a Boolean function. So oftentimes a function that performs an action or does a test will return a Boolean, meaning that the function did some sort of action, the action succeeded. Okay, I'm going to say true. If it didn't succeed, I'm going to return false. Other times, if I'm testing to see whether something is or is not, you might be calling a function that's like isInt. So isInt asks a question: is it an integer, true or false? Okay, and here's for an example, like write file. So maybe that does an action; it writes a file, and if the file succeeds in writing, it returns true. In which case, not true, putting the exclamation on it, would make this false, and so nothing would echo out. But let's say it failed to write the file. So say I'm looking at Microsoft Word and you're trying to save your work. You would like to know if it failed to write the file. Well, if it failed to write the file, then maybe this returns false. Putting a not in front of it makes it true. If now comes into action, if true, then echo file not written. So notice the logic here seems to be a bit the reverse. Okay, write file would be true if it writes and false if it nots. I actually want to know when it didn't, so I put the not there in front of it to reverse the logic so that I know when it wasn't written I want to take action and like tell you that it wasn't written. Go ahead and try looking at exercise 3. Make some notes, do some examples, but do take a look at that. So how are functions documented? You might see that on php.net. You can see a lot of functions there, so it's useful to know how they're documented. Usually they give the name of the function, whether that's the identifier, of course, so it's like function name and then the type, which means it's the return type, and then whatever's the type of argument 1 and what is argument 1, 2, 3, and if you have these square brackets here, square brackets should be like that. Okay, so a square bracket like that means that that's an optional argument. It means you don't have to put it in. If it's not in a square bracket, it's expecting that you put it in. So here's an example of printf. It tells you the document, what that function does, which PHP versions it's useful for, and now here is the signature, which says, see, printf is the name, it returns nothing, void. It expects the first parameter to be a string, which is going to be the format of that's going to be used for printf, and then optionally the arguments that you want to give it. And the word mixed here means that it's not any particular type, it could be any kind of data. Just for fun, let's go take a look at php.net, and let's look at some of the array functions that maybe we were looking at before. So I'm going to go array, and let's take another one like on something we haven't seen before. Here's array flip. It says exchange all the keys with their associated values. So let's take a look at that. See, here's the name and what it does, and here's your interface. Okay, and notice it says the name, the identifier is array flip. It accepts its first argument. Its first argument is an array, right? And the array is going to be named for the documentation purposes $array. So anytime you see the word array, it's referring to what you put in here. So it says array flip returns array in flip order, i.e. keys from array and this array. So these arrays here refer to whatever you stored in there, and it's supposed to be of type array, so it's expecting an array type. Obviously, if I'm flipping an array, I'm going to give it an array to flip. And then it returns an array, presumably the array that was flipped. And so you can read this documentation and get a little more careful about that. Go ahead and do lab 4, or at least take a look at lab 4. And we're moving on. So those are functions that are already defined for you that you're using, maybe from a library or built into PHP. How would you create your own functions? Well, you can define a function quite easily by just using the keyword function, and then you give it the identifier, parentheses, the parameters, close the parentheses, and then the block of code to execute when that function is called between the curly braces here. And if you want to return a value at some point, you need to use the keyword return and then give it an expression to return. You can have return in multiple places, but once return is executed, it leaves the function and goes back to the caller. So here's some examples. Generically, here's a function with the name and variable 1, 2, 3, and then statements return. Here's like an example of a function that would take a number as an input and square it and return it. So function square sounds like a good name. $num means that's the variable that's going to accept the value of the parameter that the user puts in there when it's called. So whenever this function square is called, it's going to put that value that's in that first position inside the variable $num. And it says $answer equals $num times num. So in other words, whatever I put into it, multiply it by itself, assign that to answer, return $answer. And so this function then becomes the value. So let's take a look at, let's say that $quantity equals 3. So I'm assigning 3 to that. And now I'm going to say square $quantity. So $quantity has a value 3, so it's going to take the number 3, puts 3 into $num, because I've called it from here. Square $quantity takes the value 3 that's in there, calls the function square, so it copies out the value that's in the parameter here and puts it into here, which is in $num, and now $num is available here, so it's 3 times 3, which is 9, and then it returns 9. And then ultimately, when I return the value 9, I assign that to my variable, my var, which then contains 9. Interestingly enough, so the variable here that's used for the parameter inside the function has nothing to do with what's used outside of it. So I actually can have something called $num outside the function and have something $num is the parameter in here, and neither of them will see each other. They're actually different variables. This variable is only local to what's inside the function here. Whereas if I define num outside, it would be valid everywhere except inside the function. So it's kind of like Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Anything outside of Vegas happens outside of Vegas. So that's the idea of global versus local variables. So for protection purposes, variables that are used inside a function are local to that function. That includes the variables that are used for the parameters. So that keeps the functions from clobbering or overwriting variables that are outside the functions, because you're not necessarily always looking about what's going on inside a function, and you don't want to make it when it's called to mess up something that's outside of it that you didn't know. So for safety's sake, they keep them separate. They're called local. You can define something called a global variable, which is going to be accessible both inside and outside of functions, but you should be sparing with those. So one example of a global variable is the $_post or the $_get arrays, because those will be useful and accessible both inside and outside of any of the functions. So they are global. In fact, they're called super globals because they're just available anywhere. But the proper way to use a function is not by defining variables to get data into it, is to pass variable data into it. If you need to change the scope, you can modify it by using the global and static. Probably not a good idea. Again, global will make something globally accessible inside and outside a function, and static will make something not change. Every time I call this function square, it reinitializes $num. So $num is not going to be the same $num as the last time you called it. But if you called it static, it wouldn't change. There's also this idea of passing by reference versus passing by value, and we'll talk about that later at the end of the lecture here. So inside a function, it's kind of like a little mini program. It takes that mini program and puts it aside until you want to use it. So it doesn't really interfere with the other parts of your program, and you can just call in and out of it as you need to by calling it. So again, functions that you define within a variable, within a function, have a local scope. They're only inside the function, and they don't exist before the function starts, and they don't exist once the function is completed unless you use the static keyword or you're using a global. So let's take a look at this. Let's say function deposit $amount. So I give it an amount to deposit, and it's going to say my balance is equal to the balance plus the amount that I deposited, and it should echo the new balance. So if I say balance equals 600, deposit 50, balance is going to be what? So I call it deposit 50, balance equals 600, balance equals 50 is what you're going to find out. Let's try that and see what that really works. I'm going to copy this code here and go over here, paste that in there, reformat, make that look nice. So there's our function, and balance equals 600, deposit 50, balance is equal balance. Let's run it, and you'll see it says new balance is 50, right? Balance is 600. So why did it print out 600? I deposited 50. right? So balance is 600. I've deposited 50. Now the balance should be 650. Well, again, what's happening is even though I set balance equal to 600, this balance is not the same as that balance. In fact, you see I got an undefined variable balance in line 17. Why? Because this balance is inside the function, so it's a local to it. If I didn't want that to be local, you could try doing this, which is again not usually a good idea. You could say global dollar balance, and let's save it there. And that didn't work. Let's take global balance and put it in here. And now what happens is, so when I defined the balance global out there, it made it global to everything out there. But if I say global balance inside here, then it's saying that this balance variable is a global variable accessible outside of the function. And so it gets defined as whatever the balance was before. It finds it, and I said balance equals 600, so now the balance is 650. What happens if I refresh this? Get the same value, right? So here, let's just take a look. Let's look at the word static and see what that does. If I say static, then it will remember what the balance was before. And so if I take this and save it. Okay, so let's see if we can get static to work, and so we can understand how that works. It's a little funny. So right now, if we run this, you see I use the static balance, and it's giving me an undefined balance in this. And that's probably because I'm trying to echo balance right here, and it hasn't been defined. So we already know that's because of local versus global. So this function, this thing, balance variable here is inside my function, see, because I'm between my blocks here. Okay, function deposit amount. I'm inside the block, so it's local to at. When I say that it's static, what actually is going to happen is that when I deposit, okay, it's going to say, wait a second, whatever the value of balance was before, if it was defined, keep it, don't initialize it new, and then add it to amount. The upshot is if I take this deposit here again, right, and I deposit, oh, not this one, sorry. If I take this here, and I say I deposit another $50 and save it, you'll see that I get now new balance is 100. And that's because what happened is I called the deposit with 50. It put 50 into dollar amount. It found that balance was static, so I said, well, don't reinitialize balance if it already exists. Just keep the value in there. Balance equals balance plus amount. So 50 was what was in there before, so now 50 plus yet another 50 is 100. Assign that to balance, and so the new balance is 100. And if I did this again, of course, it's just going to keep doing that. But notice if I take the static out and run it, I get errors. Boom, 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 boom. And it says the new balance is 50, the new balance is 50, the new balance is 50. Well, what's happening here is I'm trying to deposit 50. 50 goes into amount, right? That gets stored into that parameter value. And now it says balance equals balance plus amount. But there was no balance. So I'm going to get an undefined variable balance because there wasn't anything defined before. So it now initializes it by default to 0, and so 0 plus 50 is 50. Then I deposit again, it goes up to here, puts that in there. Again, balance doesn't exist, initializes to 0, gives me an error, puts 50 in there. So when I made it static, that had the upshot of not overwriting the value of balance if it already existed. In other words, it keeps it around. When I don't have static, it's dynamic, meaning that it just disappears once the function is finished executing. Static makes it stick around. That may or may not be useful, I don't know. So there's some logic that you have to be careful about. Here's a function called swap two values a and b, and it says $temp equals a, so it saves the value of a into a temporary variable, because if I don't and I want to swap the two, I'm going to end up overwriting it. So now it says take whatever's in b and put it in a, and now whatever was in b before, take that from temp. And so this is going to swap the values a and b. Let's take a look at this code. Let's try it out. It's always useful to try these things out here. And paste that like that. And if I run it, you see when I say $var equals 1, $var equals 2, var2 equals 2, it says echo var1, echo var2. So var1 and var2 is 1 and 2. It's just what I defined it as. Now I call swap two values, and then I call it again, and I notice nothing swapped. Well, why didn't it swap? Didn't it swap the values here? Well, the problem is that these values are local to it. In other words, sure, I swapped a and b, but it was just a and b in here. So if I took the value, if I looked like this, if I don't say var1 like this, if I say $a, because remember, whatever I put in here is going to be a, so that's var1, and here I'm going to say $b, and now I do it after like this, you'll see that now it swapped it, right? var1 is here, let's take this out for a second here and run that, and you can see that, oops, let's see, I'm gonna get these guys out there. I just don't want to print all the clutter. So var1 is 1, var2 is 2, because that's what prints out when it comes in. It swaps the two, and now var1 is 2 and var2 is 1. But when it comes back out here again, var1 and var2 are exactly what they were before. What you're seeing here is called copy pass by value and not by reference. In other words, when swap two values is called var1, var2, var1 has the value 1, var2 equals the value 2. So it actually just takes the values out of here, stores it in A, and the value there, and stores it in B, and operates it. It doesn't actually take the variable 1 and 2. If you want to do that, you need to do a pass by reference, not a pass by value. Let's see how that can work. So again, oh, yeah, what would happen if we use $A and $B? In other words, let's just try that. Is it because the names are different? No. So let's just say I'm going to take this out here. I don't need that. What if I said $A equals this, and $B equals that, and $A equals this, and $B equals that? And now if I run it, I'm going to get the same result. Oh, I'm printing out the wrong things. Let's say $A, $B, $A, $B. Should have done a find and replace, right? Okay, look, see, 1, 2, 1, 2. So it's not that the name is not the same, because what's really happening is when I call A and B, it copies the value out of that, copies into this. This is local to this. So I'm passing only the value. I'm not passing the reference, which is the variable itself. Because remember, the variable is just a place in memory that stores a value. So I'm not passing that. I'm passing actually what's stored there. So it creates a new variable. So it's not the name. And by the way, you see, it's kind of a bad habit. You should never use the same variables outside as you use for parameters for a function. because it can get pretty darn confusing, as you see. So we'll see later on how to pass something by reference if you want to. There's some function naming conventions that you should follow. Again, you don't have to do this, but you should do this because it'll make it easier. That if you have a function that just performs a series of actions and it doesn't really it's not meant to return a variable, a value, it's not calculating something, for example, then you should use a verb. So sort of action item. So when I say something like sort or print table, you see it's going to not maybe output something, or it's going to sort, it's going to do something to an array, but it doesn't return anything. And as a result, I call that function with an action word or a verb. Again, this is convention. It just helps you understand. Use nouns to name functions that do return a value or a piece of data, any sort of thing like date. So it figures out what the date is and returns the date. So it becomes a thing. Because it returns a value, it becomes the thing that it returns, so we tend to use a noun. You want to start function names with a lowercase letter. You don't have to, because the case is unimportant, but it's a good idea. Use underscore to space as a space to separate words like is bool instead of smashing them together. And please use descriptive names like get HTML translation table. Don't be stingy. PHP doesn't care how long your names are. It's not going to make it any less efficient. It just puts a reference to that function somewhere in memory, and so you don't really have to worry about how big it is. Make it as descriptive as possible. So we're almost done here, so let's talk a little bit about passing by value versus passing by reference. When a function is called, the value of the argument is copied. We already signed that, and as it assigns it locally to the things, to the parameters of that function. So variables used as arguments cannot be changed by a function. In other words, if I use a variable that's outside a function, it can't be changed inside a function. The way you can do that is you can pass a function, you can pass a value by reference. And so let's take a look at this function here called doubler. Okay, we'll paste this in here, and you see what this function does. It takes on a value and returns 2 times that value. So what I'm going to do is when I return that value, I'm just going to take that value and reassign it to the variable that I want to double. So if I say echo doubler, double up, it's gonna, and then assign double up to doubler, double up. It should take care of that. Of course, to call this function, I need to define double up. So let's make double up, I don't know, 3. So I define double up as 3, and I save that. There, I get 6. So what happens is, say I'm echoing doubler, and so it returns the value. It takes 3. 3 goes into here. 2 times 3 is 6. It returns 6, and so when I echo, I get 6. Now what I'm going to say is say doubler equals double up, which then assigns it back to itself, and that's going to change the value. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to move it. By the way, here's a little shortcut. You may have noticed what I've done is instead of cutting and pasting, you can select your code and just drag it. And in this case, I don't want to echo double up because that's going to make it 6. It's going to double up 6, so it'll make it 12. So I'm just going to echo that and see I get 126. Why did I get that? Oh, because I left this here. I don't want that there. There, I get 6. So double up is equal to 3. I say double or double up, so it takes 3, puts it in here, turns it to 6, returns 6. This is 6. 6 is assigned back to double. Echo double up, I get 6. But if I say echo double, so that's a way for me to change the value. So I'm actually changing the value outside the function by just reassigning it to myself. This is probably the better way to change variables by changing it from the return type. There is another way to do it. Let's take a look at that swap again. Another way to do it is to pass the things by reference. It's kind of a dangerous thing to do. So when we talk about a reference, it usually means the address. So when you define a variable in PHP or in any programming language, it actually takes that name of the variable, the identifier, puts it on a table and gives it an address, like a number, like a location. And you can get that address by putting the and or the ampersand in front of it. And if you pass in the address of the variable and not the variable itself, it will use the address as a reference and copy the value into that address rather than copying the value from the variable and then copying it to a new variable. So watch doubler again. So previously I had doubler. The only difference between this doubler and the old doubler was I have the ampersands in here. And now when I run it, you see it says var1 is 1, var2 is 2. Now look, var2 1 is 2 and var2 1 is 1. Because I passed the addresses, right, it actually swapped the values. So A and B are the addresses for the thing that I passed in, which is going to be the location for var1 and the location for var2. I say put A in the location in temp for whatever's in A, which is for the location of var1. Okay, put it in there, and let A equal B, which is now the same. It's the location for that, and then put that there. So it may be a little confusing. This is not something you should generally do unless you really know what you're doing and you really want it. So once again, if I take this out, if I take this out, it's going to be a pass by value, and see, it doesn't actually swap anything. But if I put the ampersands in, it passes the reference and it does swap them. Okay, so that's it. There you have it. That's your functions. That is your lecture on functions. Go ahead and do Lab 5, or at least take a look at them. And please come prepared to ask questions and get more examples so that we can do more, the lab and be prepared to make good use of functions.